The first time somebody told me I was trespassing on my own land, I was holding a paper plate with a hot dog on it, standing under a crooked white tent, listening to a bluegrass band play "Take Me Home Country Roads" like it was the most normal Saturday in the world. It was August of 1999, hot enough in southern Missouri to make the blacktop shimmer, and I had driven 8 hours from St. Louis because my Aunt Ruth had died 3 weeks earlier and left me the only thing she ever cared about more than her old pickup truck, 780 acres of woods, pasture, creek bottom, and a mill pond called Blue Heron Lake. I had not seen that land in nearly 20 years. Back then it was just Uncle Walter's place, the kind of place where you could catfish with canned corn, got yelled at for leaving gates open, and learned that a quiet man could say more with one look than most folks could say in an hour. I figured I would find the old farmhouse leaning harder to one side, maybe a few cows loose in the lower pasture, maybe Uncle Walter's rusted tractor half swallowed by weeds behind the barn. What I did not expect was a stone entrance gate, a row of decorative street lamps, and a sign that read, "Welcome to Redbud Landing, Private Community." Now, when I say stone entrance gate, I do not mean a couple of rocks with a mailbox stuck between them. I mean one of those big fake country club gates with a guard booth, flower beds, and a fountain that probably cost more than Uncle Walter ever made in one good year. Behind it sat neat little houses with matching porches, matching shutters, matching mailboxes, and just enough American flags to make you wonder if somebody had started handing them out at closing. I pulled my truck over on the shoulder and stared at the sign for a long time. The road in front of me used to be a dirt track. When I was a boy, it ran past an old feed shed, crossed a shallow creek, and ended at the mill pond where Uncle Walter kept a rowboat tied to a cedar stump. But now that same road had been paved, widened, painted with yellow lines, and decorated with little wooden signs that pointed toward things like clubhouse, swim dock, fitness trail, and picnic lawn. I remember sitting there with both hands on the steering wheel, telling myself I'd taken a wrong turn, even though there was no wrong turn to take. The mailbox was still there on the county road, old and dented and painted the same dark green Aunt Ruth liked. The numbers were still crooked on the side, Rourke, 147. Same place, same land, different world. I drove through the gate because there was no guard in the booth, just a handwritten note taped to the window that said Labor Day Fish Fry at the Lake. Residents and guests welcome to Art. That's Labor Day Fish Fry at the Lake. Residents and guests welcome. I thought maybe that was all it was. Some kind of neighborhood event near the edge of the property. Maybe the land had been split before Aunt Ruth passed and nobody told me. I had not opened the estate papers more than once, and I will admit that was my mistake. I had spent the last few years working shut-down jobs at factories, sleeping in cheap motels, eating breakfast out of vending machines, telling myself I would visit Aunt Ruth when things slowed down. Things never slowed down. Then one morning, I got a call from a lawyer in Rolla, saying she had passed quietly in her sleep and left everything to me. There are some calls you spend your whole life expecting and still somehow they knock the wind out of you. That was one of them. So I drove down to Blue Heron Lake with a truck full of work clothes, a duffel bag, and enough guilt to fill a grain silo. And when I reached the water, there were maybe 200 people standing around the shore eating catfish, drinking lemonade, and tossing beanbags near a brand new pavilion that had absolutely no business being there. The old dock was gone. In its place sat a wide cedar deck with metal railings and benches. The fishing trail had been turned into a paved walking path. There were picnic tables, a volleyball net, a little wooden playground, and a row of golf carts parked near the pavilion like the place had always belonged to folks who wore pressed khaki shorts and carried folding lawn chairs in the back of minivans. I got out of my truck and walked toward the lake without saying a word. I was trying to recognize something. A tree. A bend in the bank. The old stump where Uncle Walter tied his boat. Then I saw it. Halfway under a row of trimmed shrubs, a cracked limestone marker with a small W carved into it. Walter Rourke. My uncle had put those markers there himself in 1967, back when he bought the first section of the property from a man who had lost it in a bad cattle year. I knew that stone. I had sat on it when I was 10 years old and watched Uncle Walter clean bluegill with a pocket knife. Before I could walk over to it, a woman in a red polo shirt stepped in front of me. She was maybe 50, maybe 55, with blonde hair that had been sprayed into place like it was holding up a bridge. She had sunglasses pushed on top of her head and a clipboard under one arm, which is usually a pretty reliable sign that you are about to have a bad conversation. She smiled at me, but it was not a welcoming smile. It was the smile of somebody who had already decided what you were before you opened your mouth. She said, "Sir, can I help you?" I said, "I hope so. I am trying to figure out why there is a picnic on my aunt's property." She blinked once, then looked over my shoulder at my truck. It was an old Ford with a dent in the tailgate, mud on the tires, and a St. Louis Union sticker on the back window. I could see her sorting me into a category in her mind, and whatever category she picked, it did not include landowner. She said, "This is Redbud Landing Common Property. Are you here with one of the residents?" I said, "No, ma'am. I am here because my aunt died, and according to her will, this entire lake belongs to me." That was when the smile changed. Not gone, exactly, just tightened around the edges. She introduced herself as Marlene Voss, president of the Redbud Landing Homeowners Association. She said it slowly, as if she expected the title to carry some kind of legal thunder. Then she told me I was mistaken. I told her I was not. She said the lake and recreation area had been under association control since 1996. I said that was funny because my aunt had owned this land since long before I learned how to ride a bicycle. She asked if I had documentation. I said I had a documentation. I said I had it in the truck along with the estate papers. She shook her head like I was a child, insisting the moon belonged to me because I could see it out the window. Then she opened a leather folder, pulled out a photocopy of something stamped and signed, and held it up in front of me. It was called a Lake Access and Maintenance Agreement. The paper said my Uncle Walter had granted Redbud Landing the permanent right to use Blue Heron Lake, the picnic grounds, the boat ramp, and the trails surrounding the water. There was his name at the bottom. Walter Rourke, or something close to it. I stared at that signature for a long time. I had seen Uncle Walter sign checks, tax forms, seed orders, even birthday cards. His W always hooked low under the line like a fishing hook. The signature on that paper looked clean, careful, almost pretty. Uncle Walter never signed anything pretty in his life. I said, "That is not his handwriting." Marlene sighed. The way people sigh when they have spent too much time dealing with unreasonable folks, except I had known her for maybe 90 seconds. She said, "Mr. Rourke, I understand this must be confusing. Your aunt was elderly. These arrangements were handled years ago." I said, "My aunt may have been old, but she was not confused, and she did not give away a lake without telling anyone." Marlene looked toward the pavilion where people were laughing. Kids were running around with paper cups of soda, and somebody had started a raffle for a new grill. Then she leaned closer and lowered her voice. She said, "You are upsetting residents." I said, "They are having a fish fry on land that belongs to my family. I think I am allowed to be upset." That was when she waved over a man in a yellow vest who had been standing near the golf carts. He had a radio clipped to his belt and the kind of posture you get when you were a volunteer fireman for 15 years and people started calling you security by accident. Marlene said, "Please ask this man to leave the property." I looked at her and laughed. Not because it was funny, but because sometimes your brain does not know what else to do when somebody says something that stupid. I said, "Lady, I am standing 10 feet from the spot where my uncle taught me how to bait a hook." She said, "You are standing on association property." I said, "Then call the sheriff." I did not mean it as a threat. I meant it because I wanted somebody with a badge to look at the land, the gate, the lake, the people, and maybe tell me I was not losing my mind. Marlene did not hesitate. She picked up a cell phone the size of a sandwich, punched in a number, and called the sheriff right there in front of me. While we waited, she kept talking, mostly to the folks drifting near us. She told them there had been a misunderstanding. She said I was a distant relative who had arrived unannounced and seemed confused about the association's rights. I heard somebody whisper, "Maybe he is after money." That stung more than I expected. Maybe because there was a little truth in the way it must have looked. I showed up after Aunt Ruth died, wearing work boots and carrying estate papers, suddenly talking about a lake full of expensive homes. But I was not after money. I was after the truth. I was after the last piece of my family that had not been sold, divided, or forgotten. Sheriff Lowell Danner arrived 20 minutes later in a White County SUV that looked like it had seen every pothole in Missouri and lost every argument with them. He was a heavy-set man in his late 50s with gray hair, tired eyes, and the patient expression of somebody who had spent 30 years separating neighbors who hated each other over fences, dogs, trees, and sometimes nothing at all. Marlene greeted him by his first name. That told me plenty. "Lowell," she said. "Thank goodness. This gentleman has been causing a disturbance." I said, Sheriff. I have been standing here talking. Marlene held up the photocopy. Lowell looked at it, looked at me, then looked around at the pavilion, the dock, the gravel parking lot, the new houses, the landscaping, all of it. He asked if I had the deed. I brought him to my truck and showed him the estate papers, the will, and an old parcel description from Aunt Ruth's lawyer. He read them quietly. Then he said the words I was afraid he would say. This is a civil matter, I said. That is my lake. He said, it may be, but I cannot decide that here. Marlene said, we have a recorded agreement. Lowell said, then you can show it to a judge. I said, so what happens now? He looked at me, and for a second I could tell he believed something about this did not sit right. He said, you do not go through their gate tonight. You go to the courthouse Monday morning, get certified copies of every record tied to this land, and you talk to a lawyer who knows property law. Then he turned to Marlene and said, and you do not file trespassing charges against a man who may own the ground he is standing on. Her face did not move much, but her eyes did. That was the first time I saw the anger under all that polish. She smiled at me and said, I hope you enjoy your weekend, Mr. Rourke. I said, I am sure I will. She said, I am sure I will. She said, you may find the truth is not as simple as you think. I looked past her at the lake, at the dock, at the little white signs that said residents only, and I said, I have been around long enough to know the truth usually gets complicated when somebody has been hiding it. Then I got in my truck and drove north to Aunt Ruth's farmhouse, with the smell of fried fish and charcoal smoke following me all the way down the road. That night, I slept in the room where I had slept as a boy, under the same faded quilt Aunt Ruth had made from old work shirts. I did not sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that lake full of strangers laughing under a tent where my uncle used to mend nets. Around 2 in the morning, I got up, walked into the kitchen, and started opening drawers. Aunt Ruth had saved everything. Bread ties, buttons, receipts, newspaper clippings, old electric bills, Christmas cards from people I did not remember. There was a metal biscuit tin above the refrigerator, the kind with a picture of a little English cottage on the lid. I almost did not open it, but something told me to. Inside were maps, tax receipts, old photographs, a folded survey from 1967, and a handwritten note in Aunt Ruth's shaky pencil. It said, if they come after the pond, look behind the false wall in Waters' workshop. He never trusted the Voss woman. That was all it said. No explanation, no date. Just one sentence, written by a woman who knew she was running out of time and apparently had decided to leave me a rope instead of a ladder. The workshop was behind the barn. It smelled like motor oil, cedar shavings, and old rain. Uncle Walter had built it himself with boards from a sawmill 2 counties over. I found the false wall behind a stack of paint cans and a broken lawnmower. It took me 20 minutes to pry loose a panel, and behind it sat an old green lockbox with a brass latch. Inside were county tax bills for every acre, letters from the assessor, copies of survey plats, and a cassette tape in a plastic case labeled Redbud Meeting, June 1996. There was also a letter from Uncle Walter, written in block letters because his hands had started shaking near the end of his life. The letter said, Mac, if you are reading this, then Ruth finally decided you were ready to come home. I'm sorry about that. I should have fought them sooner. They moved a fence by the pond in the spring of 1996. Marlene said it was temporary while they repaired the road. Then men came with bulldozers, and after that, every time I asked questions, somebody told me I had already agreed. I never agreed to a thing. I kept the proof. Do not get mad first. Get smart first, Walter. I sat on the workshop floor with that letter in my hands until the sun came up. I had spent 20 years thinking Uncle Walter did not care much about anything except weather, cattle, and whether I remembered to shut the barn door. But there it was, plain as day. He had been fighting alone. And all those years I had been too busy chasing overtime, pretending I would come back someday. Well, someday had finally arrived, and it was wearing a red polo shirt, carrying a clipboard, and telling me I did not belong. Part 2. The Fight. Monday morning I was parked outside the Hawthorne County Courthouse before the doors opened. I had not shaved, I had barely eaten, and I had made 3 copies of every paper in that lockbox because Uncle Walter's last instruction was still ringing in my ears. Do not get mad first. Get smart first. The county recorder was a woman named Eileen Marsh, 60 if she was a day, with silver hair, reading glasses on a chain, and the kind of face that told you she had watched too many people try to sell land they did not own. I handed her the parcel number and told her I needed every recorded document involving Blue Heron Lake, the Rourke property, Redbud Landing, and any access agreement filed between 1994 and 1999. She did not ask why. She just nodded, disappeared into a back room, and came back 40 minutes later with 3 thick folders and an expression I did not like. She said, "Well, Mr. Rourke, you have got yourself a mess." I said, "I figured as much." She pointed to a plat map filed in 1996. It showed Redbud Landing extending right across the southern edge of our property, including the lake, dock area, and 27 acres of pasture. I said, "That is not right." She said, "I know. The legal description does not match the boundaries in the original deed. It was filed as an amendment to the subdivision plan, but there is no deed transfer attached, no signed easement, no notarized conveyance, no notarized conveyance, no tax adjustment. Nothing." I said, "Then how did it get accepted?" Eileen looked at me over her glasses. She said, "Papers get filed. That does not always mean they are good papers." She showed me the lake access and maintenance agreement Marlene had waved in my face. It was in the file, but only as a photocopy. No original, no notary stamp, no witness signatures, no supporting transfer record. The more I looked at it, the worse it got. The signature was wrong, the dates did not line up, and the survey company listed at the bottom had dissolved in 1997 after the owner died. There was one more detail that made my stomach turn. The survey had been stamped by a man named Dale Pritchard, a licensed surveyor I vaguely remembered from town. Eileen checked the file and said Dale Pritchard had died in February 1996. The plat was supposedly signed in June 1996. I asked her to say that again. She did, slower this time, in June 1996. I asked her to say that again. She did, slower this time. The man whose seal appeared on the map had been dead for 4 months before the map was filed. That was when I stopped feeling confused. Confused is what you feel when you do not have enough information. What I felt then was something cleaner and colder. Somebody had stolen land. They had stolen it from an old man who was sick, from an old woman who was trying to hold on, and from a family that had been too scattered to notice until the porch lights were already on and the picnic tables were already full. Eileen told me to call Nadine Cole. She said Nadine used to work for the state land office before opening a little law practice above a hardware store in Rolla. I found Nadine's office after lunch. The stairway smelled like dust, old paint, and somebody's chilly lunch. Nadine herself was a small woman with dark hair cut close to her chin, a sharp blue suit, and a coffee mug that said "I have, read the fine print." I liked her immediately. I laid everything on her desk: the tax records, the map, the photocopied agreement, the letter from Uncle Walter, and the cassette tape. She listened without interrupting. Then she picked up the survey map, turned it sideways, and said, "Well, I have seen better lies." I said, "Is it enough?" She said, "It is enough to start." Then she looked at me and said something I needed to hear. "Do not go back there alone. Do not yell at anybody. Do not touch their gate, their signs, their dock, or their precious little flower beds. People like Marlene Voss spend their whole lives waiting for someone to lose their temper around them. Makes their story easy. We are not going to give her an easy story. We are going to give her a nizzy story. We are going to give her a difficult one." I asked what that meant. Nadine said it meant records, witnesses, a real survey, and patience. I told her patience was not my best skill. She smiled a little and said, "That is fine. I have enough patience for both of us, and I charge by the hour." Over the next 2 weeks, my life became a stack of folders on Nadine's office floor. We hired a surveyor named Clay Barlow, a former Marine with a bad knee, a tobacco habit, and a way of looking at a map like it had personally offended him. Clay had surveyed half of Hawthorne County, including the original Rourke property line in the 80s, when he was working under an older surveyor. He came out to the land with a tripod, a transit, a clipboard, and a cooler full of bologna sandwiches. We spent 3 days walking fence lines, creek beds, and old cattle paths. The weather was hot, the chiggers were hungry, and the mosquitoes acted like they had been waiting since 1974 for somebody to come back. Clay found the first boundary marker near a cedar tree behind the new tennis court. It had been pulled from the ground and buried sideways under gravel. The second one was behind the clubhouse dumpster. The third had been cut in half and used as part of a flower bed border. Clay stood there holding that broken marker in both hands, and I swear I have never heard a man get that angry over a piece of old metal. He said, "This is not weather damage. This is not a mistake. Somebody did not just lose track of a line Mac. Somebody moved it." By the end of the week, Clay had drawn a new map that showed exactly what Redbud Landing had taken. 31 acres, including the entire lake shore, the old boat ramp, the picnic meadow, and the trail system around Blue Heron Lake. The association had built its nicest amenities on the only part of the raw land that anyone with eyes would want. The rest was woods and pasture. The lake was money. The lake was property values. The lake was the reason those neat little homes had sold in the first place. Nadine filed for an emergency injunction to stop any further construction, and that was when Marlene stopped pretending I was simply confused. I got a certified letter at the farmhouse saying I owed Redbud Landing $1,200 for unauthorized entry, disruption of a community event, and hostile conduct toward association officers. I read it twice, then laughed so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. I called Nadine and said, "They fined me for walking near my own pond." She said, "Save the envelope." I said, "That is all you have to say." She said, "Mac, when someone mails you evidence, you do not complain. You thank them." The funny thing about small towns in 1999 was that news did not travel through social media. It traveled through church parking lots, diner counters, fax machines, and people who called each other after supper. By the end of the month, everybody in Hawthorne County had heard some version of the story. According to Marlene's version, I was an out-of-town man trying to destroy a peaceful neighborhood and force families out of their homes. According to the version told at Bessie's Cafe, I had come back from St. Louis with a shotgun and threatened to drain the lake. I had not done either of those things. I did not own a shotgun, and draining the lake would have been a lot of work for a man who mostly wanted his uncle's dock back. But that is how people operate when they are scared. They take the truth, put a funny hat on it, and send it down the road. One afternoon I drove into town for groceries and found a flyer taped to the bulletin board outside the post office. It said, "Save Redbud Landing from greedy outsiders." Underneath was a grainy photocopy of my driver's license photo from the estate file. I stood there for a while looking at my own face, trying to decide whether I should be angry or impressed that somebody had gone to the trouble. Then an old man named Vernon Pike walked up beside me. Vernon owned the feed stall. He had known Uncle Walter since they were teenagers. He read the flyer, snorted, and said, "Well, they sure did pick a bad picture of you." I said, "That is not the part you are supposed to notice." He said, "I know." Then he looked at me and said, "Your uncle came in here 3 years ago, bought fence wire, said he had to repair the south line before those people turned his pond into a hotel. I asked him why he never told me. Vernon shrugged. He said, Walter was proud. Proud men wait too long sometimes. That hurt, because it was true. I had done the same thing in my own way. I had waited too long to come home. A few nights later, somebody drove slowly past the farmhouse and threw a brick through the front window. No note, no warning. Just a brick wrapped in a copy of the Redbud Landing newsletter. I found it on the floor beside Aunt Ruth's old rocking chair. For a long time I stood there looking at the broken glass, listening to crickets outside, and I felt something in me starting to come loose. I wanted to drive straight to that gated neighborhood, walk into Marlene's perfect clubhouse, and ask her if this was what community meant to her. I wanted to make enough noise that everybody in the county heard it. Instead, I swept up the glass, put the brick in a paper bag, and called Sheriff Denner. He came out after dark, took pictures, wrote a report, and stood with me on the porch for a while. He said, "You doing all right?" I said, "You all right?" I said, "No, not really." He nodded like that was the honest answer. Then he said, "I have known Marlene a long time. She was not always like this." I asked what happened. He looked toward the distant lights of Redbud Landing, he said. Her husband lost a lot of money when the lumber business folded. They built that subdivision hoping the lake would make it sell. When sales slowed, the association got behind. The pond became their whole value. I said, "So they took mine." He said, "I am not defending it. I am telling you people do ugly things when they start believing they are protecting something they built. Sometimes they forget they built it on somebody else's ground." That did not make me forgive her. but it helped me understand the shape of the thing I was fighting. Marlene was not just greedy. She was terrified. Terrified of losing the neighborhood, the money, the little kingdom she had built from meetings, bylaws, committees, and matching lawn signs. But fear does not make theft less like theft. It just makes people better at explaining it to themselves. The real break in the case came from a man named Harold Finch. Harold had been Redbud Landing's maintenance supervisor when the first roads went in. He was a quiet fellow in his early 60s with big hands, a bent back, and the habit of looking over both shoulders before saying anything important. He came to see me one rainy Thursday night after Nadine's office had closed. I was sitting in my truck outside the hardware store when he tapped on the window. He said, "You Mac Rourke." I said, "Depends who is asking." He said, "A man who has been carrying something around too long." We went inside the closed diner across the street because Harold said he did not want to talk in a parking lot. He ordered coffee, never drank it, and pulled a manila envelope from under his jacket. Inside were copies of invoices, handwritten work orders, and a Polaroid photo of a bulldozer pushing over the old south fence line. On the back of the photo, somebody had written April 1996. Harold said Marlene had told the crew the fence was wrong and had to be moved before road construction. I asked who told her that. He said, "Nobody. She just said the paperwork was handled." Then he pulled out a cassette tape, not the one Uncle Walter had left me, but another one. Uncle Walter had left me, but another one. This one had Redbud board meeting written on it in black marker. Harold said he used to record meetings for minutes because the secretary was always behind. He had made a copy one night after hearing something he knew was not right. I asked why he kept it all these years. He looked down at his hands and said, "Because I had a mortgage, a daughter in college, and not much courage." Then he looked back up and said, "But I got grandkids now. I do not want them thinking old Harold helped steal a lake." Nadine had the tape cleaned up by a local audio guy who worked out of a radio repair shop near the interstate. The sound was rough at first, lots of chairs scraping, people coughing, somebody opening a can of soda. Then Marlene's voice came through, clear as a church bell. She said, "Walter Rourke is sick. Ruth cannot manage the place, and by the time anyone notices, we will have years of community use behind us." One man asked whether they needed Walter's approval. Marlene said, "We need a document that looks like approval." Another voice, deeper and quieter, said, "Dale Pritchard's seal is still in the old office. Nobody checks these things out here." The room went silent on the tape after that. Then somebody laughed. Just a little laugh. That was the part that stayed with me. Not the crime, not the plan. The laugh. That was the part that stayed with me. Not the crime, not the plan. The laugh. Like they had gotten away with something clever. Nadine listened to the tape twice without saying a word. Then she leaned back in her chair and said, "Well, Mac, I think we just found the part where they stopped calling you confused." The case moved fast after that. The judge granted the injunction. Construction stopped. The pool contractor pulled his equipment out. The association had planned to build a second dock and a little event center near the lake, but suddenly nobody wanted to touch the job. Redbud Landing called an emergency community meeting at the clubhouse, and I was invited, though I knew that word was doing a lot of work. Nadine told me I did not have to go. I said I wanted to see their faces. She said, "Then you sit in the back, you keep your mouth shut, and you let them talk." I had spent weeks wanting to confront Marlene. Turns out silence can be a pretty good weapon too. The clubhouse was packed. Folding chairs, coffee urns, nervous people whispering into paper cups. Marlene stood at the front wearing a navy suit and a smile that looked like it had been stapled on. She said the association was facing a baseless legal challenge. She said the land dispute was being handled by attorneys. She said outside interests were trying to interfere with Redbud Landing's future. Then a woman in the second row stood up. Her name was Mrs. Ellison, a retired schoolteacher who had lived there since the first houses were built. She asked, "Did Mr. Rourke's uncle sign the lake agreement?" Marlene said, "Yes, of course." Mrs. Ellison asked, "Then why did the court stop construction?" Marlene said, "Technical matters are being reviewed." Another man stood up and asked why the surveyor's stamp belonged to a dead man. That one landed hard. You could feel the air change in the room. Marlene looked toward the door, and I saw her notice me sitting in the back. For a second she froze. Then she said, "This is exactly why we are being careful. Rumors and accusations are dangerous." I stood up. Nadine had told me to keep quiet, and I had. But there is a point where quiet turns into permission. I said. Marlene, you told this room I was trying to destroy their community. I'm not. I'm trying to find out why your community was built on my family's land. She said, you do not understand what this place means to people. I said, I understand it better than you think. I understand people got married here. I understand kids learned to fish here. I understand families paid good money believing everything was legal. But none of that gives you the right to take something from an old man because you thought he was too sick to fight back. Nobody said a word. Marlene looked at me with a kind of hatred I had only seen once before in a dog that had been cornered and did not know where to run. Then she said, you want to know the truth, Mr. Rourke. The truth is that Lake was sitting there doing nothing. We made it useful. We made it valuable. I said, no, ma'am. You made it profitable. There is a difference. Part 3. The Return. The hearing started in October, just as the trees around Blue Heron Lake were turning red and gold, which felt almost unfair because the land had never looked more peaceful while everything around it was coming apart. The courthouse in Hawthorne County was not grand. It had old wooden benches, a flag in the corner, a ceiling fan that clicked every third rotation, and a judge named Margaret Sloane, who looked like the kind of woman who had heard every excuse a person could invent and forgotten most of them before lunch. Marlene sat at the defense table with 2 lawyers from Springfield and a stack of binders. She looked smaller than she had at the lake. Not weak, exactly, just less certain. The first witness was Clay Barlow. He laid out the original survey, the current survey, and photographs of the buried markers. He explained in slow, plain language that the original property line had never changed. The only thing that changed was where Redbud Landing decided to pretend it was. One of Marlene's lawyers asked if the markers could have been moved by flooding, erosion, or weather. Clay looked at him for a moment and said, Sir, weather does not bury a steel survey marker under a tennis court. A few people in the gallery laughed before Judge Sloane gave them a look. Then Nadine called the document examiner. She was a woman from Jefferson City who compared handwriting, seals, ink, paper, all the things most of us never think about until somebody tries to use them to take your house. She said the signature on the lake access agreement was not Walter Rourke's. She said it had been traced from an old tax document. She said the survey stamp had been copied after Dale Pritchard died. She said the paper had been manufactured after the date written on the agreement. Each answer hit the room like a hammer strike. Marlene did not move much. She just kept staring at the table. Then Nadine played the cassette tape. You could hear the hiss, the old recorder, picking up every little room sound. And then Marlene's voice came through again. Walter Rourke is sick. Ruth cannot manage the place. By the time anyone notices, we will have years of community use behind us. I looked toward the gallery. A lot of Redbud Landing residents were there. Some had brought their spouses. Some sat with their arms crossed. Some were crying. One man I recognized from the fish fry put his head in his hands. I felt sorry for them, and I did not. That may not sound noble, but it was honest. They had been lied to. They had also enjoyed the lie for years. They had used the lake, sold homes because of the lake, told themselves it was all fine because a board meeting said so. I knew most of them were not criminals. But I also knew nobody had asked enough questions when the answers would have been inconvenient. When it was my turn to testify, Nadine asked me what I wanted from the court. Not money, not punishment, not revenge, just what I wanted. I looked at Judge Sloane and said, I want my family's land back. I want the association to stop using it like it is theirs, and I want the people who did this to understand that an old man being sick does not make his property available. I said Uncle Walter had been quiet, but he was not foolish. I said Aunt Ruth had spent her last years watching strangers build roads where my uncle used to walk his cattle. I said I did not come back because I wanted to tear down a neighborhood. I came back because somebody had to tell the truth before the truth got buried under another layer of asphalt. Marlene's lawyers tried to make me sound angry, opportunistic, bitter. They asked why I had not visited more often. That one hurt. I could have lied. I could have said work kept me away. Life kept me away. Life kept me away. Distance kept me away. But the truth was simpler. I stayed away because I thought there would always be time. So I said that. I said I should have come sooner. I should have called more. I should have noticed. But me failing my family does not give somebody else the right to steal from them. Even Marlene looked up at that. Judge Sloane took the matter under review overnight. The next morning, the courtroom was full before 9. Redbud Landing residents sat on one side. Folks from town sat on the other. Sheriff Danner stood near the back wall with his hands folded in front of him. Marlene came in wearing the same navy suit, but her hair was different, not as perfect. Maybe that sounds like a small thing, but when you've spent months watching someone control every detail around them, one loose strand can feel like a confession. Judge Sloan read her ruling slowly. She found the 1996 Lake Agreement invalid. She found the subdivision plat fraudulent. She found that Redbud Landing had knowingly built common facilities on Rookland without a lawful transfer or easement. She ordered the association to return the 31 acres, remove all private structures from the lake shore within 120 days, and pay damages for unauthorized use, environmental cleanup, and legal costs. She also referred the forged survey and false document evidence to the county prosecutor. When she finished, nobody moved. It was the kind of silence you hear after a bad storm when you are trying to figure out which tree fell. Then Marlene stood up. Her lawyer grabbed her sleeve, but she pulled away. She said, "You cannot do this. You will destroy the community." Judge Sloan told her to sit down. Marlene pointed at me and said, "He does not care about any of these people. He only cares about any of these people. He only cares about winning." I stood up before anybody could stop me. I said, "No, Marlene, I care about the people. That is the difference between us. You cared about what they could pay for." Her face went pale. Sheriff Danner took one step forward, not because I had threatened her, but because he could see she might do something foolish. Marlene looked around the courtroom, maybe expecting somebody to defend her. Nobody did. Not one person. That was the moment it ended for her. Not when the judge ruled, not when the tape played. It ended when the people she had used to justify everything decided they were done standing behind her. The next few months were strange. You would think a win like that feels like fireworks. It does not. Not at first. It feels like paperwork, phone calls, inspectors, muddy boots, and people with clipboards measuring things that should never have been built. The tennis court came out first, then the playground, then the wooden pavilion where I had been told I was trespassing. The dock took longest. It had been bolted into the lake bed with thick steel rods, and every time one of them came loose, the whole structure groaned like it was mad about being asked to leave. Redbud Landing residents came out to watch. Some were angry, some were embarrassed, some just looked tired. One afternoon, Mrs. Ellison came up to me while workers were tearing down the picnic shelter. She said, "I should have asked more questions." I said, "Maybe." She nodded and said, "I thought trusting the board meant being a good neighbor." I told her, "Trusting people is not the problem. Letting them tell you not to look is the problem." She said she had been a teacher for 34 years, and that was probably the most annoying thing anybody had said to her all year. Then she smiled a little, and I smiled back. In the end, Redbud Landing did not disappear. That surprised some people. The homes stayed. The residents formed a new board. They paid their share of the settlement, and a few sold their houses because they could not afford the special assessment. Marlene Voss resigned before the criminal case started. Her husband moved them to Arkansas to live with his sister. At least that was the story I heard. I never saw her again. Part of me hoped she would end up in prison. Another part of me understood that losing the world she had built might have been its own kind of sentence. I do not know. Maybe that is for God to sort out. What I know is this. On the first day of spring in 2000, I walked down to Blue Heron Lake before sunrise. The pavilion was gone. The dock was gone. The signs were gone. There was no gate, no guard booth, no flower beds, no little wooden arrows telling people where to park their golf carts. Just the water, the trees, the old pasture, and the sound of frogs starting up along the bank. Clay had helped me reset the original markers. We put the first one back near the cedar stump where Uncle Walter used to tie his boat. I knelt beside it and brushed the dirt away until I could see the initials carved into the stone. WR, 1967. I sat there for a long time, thinking about Uncle Walter's letter. Do not get mad first, get smart first. It was good advice, better than most advice I ever got from a man who barely talked. I still get angry when I think about what happened. I get angry at Marlene. I get angry at the people who laughed on that tape. I get angry at myself for not coming home sooner. But I also think about those residents, the ones who bought houses believing the lake was part of the deal. Some of them lost money, some of them lost friends. Some of them found out that the people they trusted most had built their little piece of paradise on a lie. Maybe they deserved better. Maybe Uncle Walter deserved better too. Maybe that is the part nobody likes to say out loud. But community is not just the people in charge. It is also the people who decide not to ask questions because they like the answer they have been given. So, I want to know what you think. Was it right to tear down every last structure, even though some families have no idea the land was stolen? Should the residents have been punished for trusting their HOA, or should every cost have fallen only on Marlene and the people who planned it? Leave your answer in the comments, because this kind of story is never just about a lake, a fence, or a piece of paper. It is about what happens when somebody decides a quiet old man is too weak to defend what is his, and what happens when the wrong person finally comes home. If you believe nobody should ever lose what they worked a lifetime to protect, hit subscribe, share this story, and stay with us, because there are plenty more battles where the truth was buried deep, but not deep enough.